Hi, and welcome back. This is Disability Saves the World with Dr. Fadi Shinoda. I am Fadi Shinoda. This podcast brings you insights from leading experts in disability and math studies from around the world. You'll hear about the research and work of disabled scholars, activists, artists, and our allies. You'll also get some insight into their lives, their favorite non-DS activities, hobbies, and adventures. Most importantly, you'll hear how they think disability can save the world. My name again is Fadi Shinoda. I use he, him pronouns and identify as a fat, disabled, cis man of color. On today's show, I am for the first time coming to you with a group of folks who are here to speak about their collective writing and drawing project, a children's book called We Move Together. They are Dr. Kelly Fritsch, Dr. McGuire and Eduardo Trejos. Kelly Fritsch is a disabled writer, educator, and parent living in Ottawa with her mischievous cat, Lulu. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University and the co-editor of Key Words for Radicals, a contested vocabulary of late capitalist struggle. Anne McGuire is an associate professor in the program for critical studies in equity and solidarity at the University of Toronto, where she teaches courses in disability studies and disabled childhoods. She is the author of War on Autism, on the cultural logic of normative violence. Eduardo Trejos is a Costa Rican multidisciplinary artist, a lover of color, insatiable reader, and a parent of 2 boys. He currently lives in Toronto where he works as a graphic designer. I'm excited to speak to them about their project.
It was really exciting and also challenging to try to figure out what parts of the story could be told through the images themselves and what parts then needed additional language.
We knew that we wanted something very colorful, just kind of showing that, that joyfulness we wanted to communicate in the book.
And how it came to be.
Kelly and I were meeting in a park. We were just talking about our shared frustration about how we couldn't find a children's book to read with our children and our children's friends that talked about or addressed or engaged with ideas of disability justice, ableism, disability joy. And so we said, well, why don't we write one?
And to discuss how they think disability can save the world. Thank you all again for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you. And it's so exciting that you are the first kind of group to be on the podcast. So I want to jump right in and ask, tell us about this project. How did it come to be?
So I think it was about 4 years ago is when we kind of had our first conversation about it. And this was outside of the CDSA conference at Ryerson. And Kelly and I were meeting in a park downtown, and we were kind of just talking about our shared frustration. We both had, quite young children at the time. I think Kelly's youngest was just a baby at that point. And yeah, so we were just talking about our shared frustration about how we couldn't find a children's book to read with our children and our children's friends that talked about or addressed or engaged with ideas of disability justice, ableism, disability joy, and things like that. And so we said, well, why don't we write one? And then we kind of pulled Eduardo into it.
Well, I will just say that you and Kelly kind of plotted the whole thing, and you kind of brought me in at some point. Well, not only to see if I would be willing to illustrate a whole book, which is something I hadn't done before, but also to discuss the ideas and the kind of plot and kind of develop characters and storylines.
Kelly and I were kind of starting to talk about the text, right? So when we're academics, like we kind of thought, okay, words are a thing. So we're going to talk about the storyline, and we developed the storyline and, some words to go along with it. Originally, it was quite simple. We move fast, we move slow, and then we kind of developed it from there. And that was a really kind of interesting process. I think in children's publishing, there's not often too much overlap between what the author does and what the illustrator does. I think the author kind of writes the story and then transfers it to the illustrator typically, and then the illustrator creates representations of that text. But it was really a back and forth process between Kelly and I and Eduardo. We shared our words, our text with Eduardo, and Eduardo would then kind of mock up different images and send them back to us and share them with us. And then we would kind of have feedback for him, and he would have feedback for us. And the whole story and the text shaped in relation to the illustrations, and the illustrations really shaped or were shaped by the text. And so it was kind of a very collaborative process of coming to these images and texts that we have now.
Yeah, partway through the process, we realized that a lot of the story could be told in the images, and that is something that Anne and I are not used to doing in our everyday work. We're used to being very, didactic and really spelling out everything that we mean to say through written language. And so it was really exciting and also challenging to try to figure out what parts of the story could be told through the images themselves and what parts then needed additional language. And this is one of the ways in which we came to develop the glossary at the back of the book, which is this section that sort of gives more context and depth to some of the ideas that we're talking about, like ableism, like pointing out different kinds of assistive devices. The glossary really gives people language tools to talk back to ableism or to think about disability culture. And so we developed that glossary precisely because we couldn't say everything in the text of the story, and we couldn't say everything through the images either. So for all of us, it was kind of this process of figuring out how we take these amazing ideas that are transforming the world and give it to children and families and community members in ways that can be easily understood through multiple kinds of modalities. So in the images, through the text, and then sort of more through a glossary encyclopedia approach.
I wondered about the three words that are the title of the book that kind of frame the book, the idea of moving, the idea of togetherness. Were those central ideas from the beginning? Did those evolve throughout the writing and drawing process? And why concentrate on this idea of moving together?
I mean, I think when I started writing the book, it was really this moment for us in disability community where disability justice as a framework was really taking off. Disability justice as a framework has been around for over 15 years, but it was really starting from our perspective to be influencing scholarship and wider social movements outside of disability movements. And so there was really this idea that if we're going to change the world, we need to take disability seriously as a major component of that. And so that's going to mean moving together with disabled people who are often left out of other kinds of social movements because of accessibility barriers, ableism, and people's own kind of limitations. So I think as I remember it, we moved together, we moved fast, we moved slow, were the basis of how we started developing the story.
Yeah, and I think we also, and it does reference the quote that we have at the start of the book, which is a quote by Patty Byrne and Aurora Levins Morales. All bodies are unique and essential. All bodies are whole. All bodies have strength and needs that must be met. We are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them, we move together with no body left behind. This is disability justice. And so those words, I think, had a big impact on how we were kind of thinking. And obviously disability justice politics is underpinning a lot of the themes of the book. And another thing I think that the idea of we move together gives us, and Kelly was getting at this as well, is this connection between our small movements, our individual movements, the ways in which we move through our communities as people, as families, as communities, as friends, and kind of broader social movements and social organizing and the ways in which movements move together. And I think that kind of idea moving together gave us, a springboard for thinking about all the ways in which those minute and larger movements are connected.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also because so often with disability, it's a very individualized approach to understanding what's happening. And so we really wanted to emphasize that disability isn't about individuals. It's actually about a community. So the way in which we understand what disability is founded, is constructed, is constituted through the relations that we live in. And so those are never going to be isolated events.
Right.
And the meaning of disability shifts in collaboration with other people and non-humans and our environments. So it was really important to us for the book to really emphasize this collective nature of defining, describing, and practicing what disability is and what disability can be.
I mean, and I think in the book, there's so clear evidence of all the collective parts of like the making together of the, when there are, there's communities together, there's people on buses together, there's people walking and jogging together and rolling together, and even though we move fast, like I think it's the first image in the there's still someone in crutches, a little bit further back, right? Not moving as fast as everybody else. And it's like one of the, like a nod to, even though we move fast, there's still people who are always going to be moving slower. And so, there's all these really, really kind of important images that we don't ever really see in children's book, let alone in other forms of representation. So you've talked a little bit about the process of, writing and drawing, how collaborative it was, how back and forth it was. I'm wondering about, how did you come up with the language of the images? Because I'm sure there were, at some point there was a conversation about what they were going to look like. So I'm just wondering about that process.
It started, collaboratively, just as well. I think we all kind of went and did our homework. We researched different children's books, images, what styles we liked, what connected with us, what we admire from different books. And we kind of came together with this image and say, okay, we like this, we like that. And with that, I went and kind of did a bit of an exploration of different styles that we can try. And it was an ongoing process too. Like we started with a certain style. Then as we progressed, we were like, we're not feeling this. We're gonna tweak a little bit, and we got to a point where we felt comfortable and it felt right. And it, we just we kind of took in all like from different sources. We knew that we wanted something very colorful. We all have a love for bright colors, and that's something we wanted to come through, and also just kind of showing that that joyfulness we wanted to communicate in the book. And you also wanted to reflect in the characters the kind of diversity that we see in our communities. All kinds of diversities, like racial diversity and gender and everything. And that was very important too from the very beginning.
That part is so clear in the book, right? The clear kind of, it looks like when you're walking down a Toronto street, right? Or it looks like when you're walking down, just a major city, right? It looks like everybody is there and everyone seems to be represented, which is really nice. And go ahead, yeah.
And it's something that is part of the frustration at the beginning, that Anna and Kelly were mentioning, like, not only do we not see disabled characters featured in children's book, but everything is very, like, we live in communities that are very diverse. Like you go to one of the scenes in the books, we imagine it to be in the annex on Bloor Street. And so you walk through the annex and it's like you see everyone, from all kinds of all walks of life. And you don't often see that in children's books. More and more, to be fair, more and more we see it, but it's been done a lot in the past in a very tokenistic kind of way. So we wanted it to feel natural, just because that's what we're all, what we live with and what we see every day.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the scenes in the book are actually like scenes from our community, our various different communities, our kids' friends, and our neighbors. And I mean, the bus, for example, in the bus scene is our local bus that we take, and the library is the local library. Along Eglinton West, and I think that was part of like what contributes to the kind of authenticity of the images. I think just to kind of go back in terms of how the images came to be, early on, after we wrote the text, Kelly and I sat down and we were on the phone actually. I don't know what you were doing, Kelly, but we were talking on the phone and kind of just brainstorming different ideas of like, okay, so we're going to talk about like moving fast. What might that look like? Where might that be? And eventually kind of coming to just general ideas of where the scenes might be set, and then leaving it to Eduardo to do mock-ups of different possibilities within this imaginary, or not imaginary, this real world that we're kind of attempting to depict.
I think one of the things that was also really important for us from the beginning was to present the idea that we're not part of perfect communities. And so the very opening scene with We Move Fast, these kids are really excited, and you can see this at the playground all the time. Kids get an idea for a game and they just take off. They get caught up in their imaginary world, and they can lose track of what's going on around them. And so these kids are really excited to be going through the park in the opening scene. And yeah, there's a child who is moving more slowly at the back, and that child is sort of raising their arm and saying, hey, wait for me, and so we try with the book to get to the idea that accessibility and disability community is not settled. There are conflicts, there are challenges, and these are things that we need to be open to discussing and thinking about, and then changing how we do things.
And I think one of those is obviously the image and the moment about conflict in the book when it comes to straws and when it comes to climate change, when it comes to climate justice, right? I think such a simple example, one that can be translated, clearly to children about who needs straws and why they might need them. But then, of course, something that we've discussed in university classes with our students and trying to, and it's been a conversation at conferences, and so clearly can translate to like lots of different people, right? The need to iron out some of the challenges and differences that come across when it comes to different communities. I do want to talk about the one particular image that I think I fell in love with the book is maybe more than halfway through the book. There's these beautiful hands kind of raised up into the sky, and there's like these three bangles around these hands. And I'm just wondering about that image. How did it come to be? It's probably the only image without a face in the book. And I remember like turning the page and specifically going like, wow, like that was like immediately I was kind of struck by it. What was it like drawing that? Why that particular kind of image? And and I showed it to my mom, and she said, what's happening in this image? And I was like, no, I think they're lying on their back. And she's like, oh, really? And so we had this like conversation about this image and what was happening in it. And anyways, I just, I have Eduardo here, so I'm going to ask this question. I just, I get the opportunity to.
That's a lovely story. I do that is one of my favorite spreads too. Not just as a final result, but like to draw in color. And it's mostly coloring. The drawing is very minimal. But this is one of the, I think, if I remember correctly, one of the earlier images that we kind of talked about. It was very clear we wanted this kind of like perspective. And it became clear that this was a spread where, you know, that a lot of things have been happening in this book, and you know, the characters have come to this place of conflict and friction that we were talking about with the straws and the environmental issues. And we wanted to follow that up with, you know, saying like, sometimes we need to take a break. Sometimes, you know, in the face of conflict, we can, you know, take a step back and you know, take that break. And that was a perfect opportunity to have that reflected in the visuals. The hands are actually my hands.
Oh.
I posed the hands in front of my computer, and I took a photo, and I kind of used that as a reference to, you know, I changed the proportions a little bit because it's our kids' hands. But you know, I use that as a base to kind of capture the pose and the motion and the fingers. But I don't know, you know, to me, it's such a beautiful image, and you know, people can, you know, find, you know, different things in it. Like people say right away, oh, it's a, you know, it's a character who's steaming. Some people say it's just, you're just lying on your back, and I'm sure that, you know, a lot of people have done this as kids, as adults, just, you know, lie on your back, look at the trees up, look up at the trees, and they look beautiful, and like just put your hands up and just enjoy the sun and the light and the blowing you know, the leaves and everything. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, so I was thinking about what you were saying earlier, Fady, about how so many of these images are about relationships and about collectives, right? There's, and as you pointed out, this is is the only image in the book where the character appears, well, I guess one of the only images where the character appears in a sense alone. And yet this image for me is about a relationship as well, very clearly, and the relationship between the character looking up and their environment. And I think I really love that aspect of moving together. So this is too an image of moving together, even though this character has taken a break, has moved away from the other characters. And yeah, I like too how, and one of the things that we talked about in this kind of scene is the way, you know, in which like there are three kind of images that are linked, the images of people outside of the lake or beside the lake who are eating and drinking and nourishing one another in a variety of different ways, including using straws and tubes. And then the next scene, which is the conflict scene, as we've spoken about, and it's the conflict scene is taken from the perspective of looking down on the conflict, right? So it's like an aerial view of this group of kids who are all kind of lying on their stomachs or sitting or and drawing on their posters. And then the final scene is down looking up. And so there's this kind of shift in perspective that happens between those scenes, as well as that. And I think that perspective change and that perspective shift can be related to kind of these moments of taking a break, right? And the value of slowing down, of stopping. And that's also something that disability has taught us all quite a bit about.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a forced introspection, right? You know what I mean? It was, which is sometimes very welcome. You know, I wondered as well, you know, you're talking about like the relationship that that is in that image, the hands with nature, with rest, with and you know, as you flip through the book, you kind of get the themes of disability studies right away, right? Like there's a section on activism, there's a section on you know, the social model, right? At some point there's a section on like a relational ontology, right? In moving with bikes, moving with machines, moving with animals, and I guess I wonder, was it difficult to translate complex DS ideas into children's sentences or sentences for a children's book? As academics, How did that? What was that process like?
I think it was a lot of trial and error.
Okay.
So, I mean, there is a reason why this book took us so many years, from first idea to actually getting it hot off the printer. Um, and part of that is because we went back and forth a ton with the language and with the visuals, and we changed the scenes around. So what order the scenes would happen in, what was sort of a logical way to build the story. And it was really important to us that this idea of movement have different kinds of temporal relations. So we often think about movement as being something that's happening quickly, but disability studies, as well as thinking more ecologically about the world, gives us different kinds of temporal relations. And so moving slowly or stopping to take a break, where you sort of put yourself in more of a temporal relationship with wind and light, and maybe the grass that you're lying in, that gives you a different sense of movement and changes your perspective on what it means for social transformation. Um, so I think a lot of the ways in which we figured out the language was also putting ourselves into these moments and thinking about how movement changes our perspective, and so thinking about academic ideas that we talk about in the classroom and translating them. It's never going to be just a one-off. It sort of happens through conversation.
Yeah, and I think, we've kind of touched on this, but at the very beginning, we did have kind of these ideas that we wanted to talk about. We wanted to talk about, or not to talk about necessarily, but to kind of engage and bring to life, animate interdependence. We wanted to touch on intergenerational memory, and transgenerational memory. And so these are kind of big concepts that we do talk about in the lecture hall, that we wanted to, that are also quite simple, I think, in some ways, because they are rooted in our everyday lives, and they're rooted in concepts that I think many people are familiar with on some level. And so, like this idea of interdependence, it's a big word. And if you say it out loud, I'm sure a lot of people be like, what are you talking about? But it is a very kind of simple concept in many ways, like this image of the bee and the flower, what is the relationship between the bee and the flower? And that's a really kind of interesting way to start to talk about the ways in which our relationships and our existence, our flourishing, our well-being is dependent upon a network of other beings, and technologies and environments. And that is a conversation that can be had with grown-ups, and it's a conversation that can be had with the really young children as well. And I think that, this trial and error oftentimes was kind of us sitting down with our own children and say, okay, like, let's have this conversation. How are we going to talk about this together? What makes sense to you? And so I think that was kind of another component that we didn't talk about earlier about in terms of the collaboration of the book, is the conversations that came after we had a first draft of the book, conversations that happened through reading to our children and our children's friends, conversations that happened when we sent the book out to all sorts of different people in disability communities across Turtle Island. And got feedback from those folks as well. And so then the book took shape in different ways again through those conversations that happened after the first draft.
Wow.
Yeah, and not only did we send it to disability communities, but the press also read a first draft of the book, and those are people who are less embedded in disability community, and so for them it was it gave us a really good outsider's perspective of how the book might be read by people who aren't quite as familiar with these ideas. And they had a lot of suggestions for how we could tweak the language or modify some of the images.
I mean, it's as someone who feels like they can get some of the themes that you guys are trying to get across, and it feels like a considerable amount of work, right, to distill some of these theoretical ideas, but they're communicated so beautifully and so easily, I feel. So there's just so much work that went into this, and it's just I mean, it's a great piece of work. I want to talk a little bit about what it was like to draw yourselves into the book, and also to draw your friends, some of your friends into the book. And was that process intimidating or fun, or yeah, what was that like?
um, I don't think it was intimidating. I mean, I think it was maybe intimidating to get Annie and Kelly's likeness. That was, that was fair. I didn't think much about drawing myself. Hoping that I don't know, draw myself any better than I actually look. I think it's fine. I think I just tried to get, and there's so many characters throughout the book that that we wanted to include many like disability activists and people who have been influential, and we wanted to honor by including them. So I tried to, portray them in a portray their likeness, and while keeping the style of the book.
Right.
In some cases, I would draw someone, and then Kelly and I would say, okay, it's too realistic. Let's just tone it down a little bit. It should be more in the style of the characters. Okay, that's fair. So yeah, it's a matter of like capturing the essence of the characters, and making sure that everyone's well represented.
I think in terms of the book, it's based on a lot of our actual experiences. So not only the experience of not being able to find children's books that talked about disability justice or ableism that we could share with our own children, but also our everyday frustrations of experiencing ableism or witnessing the ways in which ableism is affecting our communities. So the scene of going for ice cream and not being able to get into the ice cream shop, that's an experience I have had in Ottawa with my kids in the heat of the summer, where it's like, let's go get some ice cream, and then we show up and there's no way to get in. And so, one of the reasons why we included ourselves was precisely because we've had these experiences. And so it has shaped our perspective on the world. And we wanted to be able to share that with others.
I love that.
Yeah, I think I was thinking like almost every spread has a story behind it, like that, we've talked about that we've either experienced or, we experienced, like the Tangled Scene actually happened as well. Like we were, my child and I were at a book release for Eli Clare's Brilliant Imperfections at Tangled, and my son was quite young at the time, and it was the first time he really kind of was captivated by the ASL interpreters, and the kinds of conversations that evolved, and after that initial encounter, that curiosity, that wonder that came from that experience. And so I think drawing us into it felt natural in the sense that we were drawing our experiences, we were drawing our worlds. But also, like what you were mentioning about incorporating other kind of figures into the book that are real people. And we talked a lot about citation. And Kelly and I are academics, we cite, and this is what we do when we write about different concepts. And we couldn't necessarily do that in the same way in the context of the children's book. And so, we were drawing on politics and frameworks of disability justice, for example, that were elaborated on and created and dreamed up and put into the world by people like Patty Byrne, people like Leroy Moore, Mia Mingus, Eli Clare, and other figures that you can spot, Alice Wong, that you can spot in the book's illustrations. And so including the images of those folks was a version, like our kind of kids picture book version of citation, and then also including their name and their work and their contributions in the glossary, so that folks reading then can learn more. And so that's part of the kind of website development and the educational curriculum that we're in the process of creating, so that we can then amplify the perspectives of various disabled artists and activists that we touch on in the book.
I mean, that's drawing them in as a form of citation. That's a really cool, almost like a, you know, a crip way of doing things, right? Just finding a different way of like, of putting people in, acknowledging their work. That's really cool. That's really cool. I guess I want to move on a little bit to thinking about behind the scenes a little bit. Were there moments of learning? Was there a particularly funny moment in this project, or things that really changed throughout the process?
I would say the whole thing, it has been a learning process. It still is. I mean, you know, Anne and Kelly have published books before, and not children's books, but, you know, academic books. So they know a little bit about the process of publishing books. This is new to me, so I do learn a lot about how to, about working with the press and putting the book out, and et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of the production of the actual book, that was also a big learning curve for me, because I've never, done any children's books. My illustration experience was limited to very small, pieces. So it gave me a lot of respect for children's book illustrators, because it's a lot of work. But yeah, I just learned, and like I mentioned before, like there was a lot of kind of evolution of the style. I mean, at some point we had to say, okay, this is our style, and we feel comfortable with it, and we're gonna move forward and do the whole book like this. But before that, just getting to that style, and the colors and the line work, was a bit of a discovery process that we went through collectively. And just, every spread there will be something where we would try to communicate these concepts and these ideas, and I would do a mock up a layout, and it didn't feel quite right. It didn't communicate the idea very well. So we'll try it in a different way, or a certain character, the posture, the hands, the action, something didn't feel quite right. For example, the kid in the first spread and the kid in the crotches, like we went back and forth as to how would this kid, what would he be doing? Is he waving? Is he, like, at some point he was actually playing interacting at the front of the group, and then it gave a different meaning to the spread, and we kind of like changed it a little bit.
So all these kind of conversations about style and language like led to the fact that we found ourselves in a position where we had a lot of work to do. Eduardo had a lot of like illustrative work to do, and like the deadline was coming. And Eduardo, as you mentioned before, and I are partners, and we kind of had this like the issue of like childcare. And so when Eduardo was, drawing in the evenings, and that meant like I was putting the kids to bed every night. And, it became kind of this like balance between, okay, you're going to put the kids to bed, but we're not going to get further with the book. And then, so there was all that kind of drama toward the end as we were approaching the deadline. And at one point, I was like, can I color in the images? Like, will you teach me how to use Photoshop? And so Eduardo taught me, and then he taught Mateo, and then all three of us, our 9-year-old son. And so we were all coloring in the evenings to get the scene. And then of course, Eduardo would take our coloring and make it look nice in the end. But so it really, again, like the collaboration behind the scenes happened, even bringing our kids involved, getting our kids involved in terms of meeting this final press deadline.
In our website, you can see a photo of Mateo coloring one of the spreads. Wow. But yeah, it got to the point where it was like I was just like be furiously drawing this these images, and then Anne and Mateo will be coloring to catch up with me.
And then, of course, our son was not so happy when his name wasn't on the cover as illustrator. So that was another tension that arose.
He's like, I'm a tester and a part-time illustrator, and I get no credit here. What's up?
He still wants parts of the royalties.
I feel like that's only fair.
Indeed.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to, as lots of people know who are involved in political projects, to do something as a second job or sort of like off the side of your desk. And so the fact that all of us are working full time and have young children and then are invested in this political project of bringing this book to the world, it definitely had a ton of challenges. And I think there was lots of times when we met and sort of just were like, how are we going to get this thing done? But it did really help that Anne and I have worked together before collaboratively doing writing. And then bringing Eduardo into the picture felt like a really natural fit, and we all, I think, trust each other quite deeply. So it's like, you know, I say I'm going to go off and do something, and Anne and Eduardo trust that I will get it done, even if it doesn't happen right away. And same with Eduardo. You know, Anne and I would talk a lot about our vision for particular scenes, and then it's just like, see what you can come up with, and it all sort of worked out.
That's wonderful.
And because Kelly and I are simultaneously working on different writing projects, both this like children's writing project, and then we're also in the process of writing an adult book together. And so some of the switch off happened at that register, you know, like, okay, Kelly, you're gonna go work on like the adult book, and then I'm gonna focus my time on the children's book, and then we'll switch so that we're getting, which is, you know, itself a form of academic interdependence, you know, like the ways in which we are navigating kind of the demands of publication in the academy through like sharing of labor and ideas through co-publishing. So that's a, you know, another example, I guess.
Just as a way to kind of wrap things up, I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about your desires for the book in the future. Who do you hope reads it? Where do you hope it ends up? Will there be a volume 2?
I think we want the book to be read widely. So this is, you know, one of our reviewers called the book a love letter to disability communities. And I think it's very much a love letter, sort of invoking disability culture and joy, the magic that can come out of doing things interdependently and working with each other for change. There is something about those experiences that really, you know, really fulfill our lives in deep and meaningful ways. But we want the book to be read outside of disability communities. And so most recently, we have developed a 60-page open source learning guide that can be used by primary education teachers primarily, although it's also adaptable to other kinds of situations like Brownie troops or community organizations that want to talk about disability. And so that learning guide has different activities, different discussion questions, ways of using the book to think a little bit more deeply about some of the issues that we bring up.
The education guide, learning guide, I think is kind of that next piece, you know, after we felt like, okay, we need a glossary, then we felt like, okay, maybe this is a, you know, a bigger project that we can kind of share some of the stories and some of the ideas behind the images, or give the, you know, as a way of prompting different kinds of conversations, both in the classroom, and I think it can be used by parents as well, and or anyone who you know, is interested in having these kinds of discussions. One of the things that a number of people have pointed out to us about the book, and one of the things that I think I'm most proud about the book is the idea that it's not, We Move Together isn't providing a set of answers about the question of disability, accessibility, ableism, social movements, and so on. It's providing a space for discussion. It's giving kind of these tantalizing sentences or images that are provocative in some way, that will hopefully generate a conversation about, okay, what is the problem at the ice cream shop? How do we kind of address this problem of plastics in a way that allows all of our communities, ensures all of our communities are flourishing? Those are big questions that we don't solve actually in the book. And I think the learning guide provides a space to have those kinds of conversations and discussions. And I think it will work. Where again, like as Kelly mentioned, we've geared it toward, roughly grade 1 to grade 4. It can be easily, I think, adapted to older students in elementary and high school even. And I plan to use it in my undergrad classes as well. I think already I've heard from several students who have picked up the book and have said, like, I understand a little bit more about what you've been talking about in class because I read this book. And I think that's really exciting for me to think about the ways in which the book can be transformative, or has the potential to be transformative for kinds of conversations that adults are having as well. Parents who are reading the book to kids, I think, will also get something out of it.
I think the learning guide is one of the things that's unique about our book compared to other children's books. But another thing that makes the book quite unique is that we've been really committed to making the book as accessible as possible. So on our website over the next couple of months, we are developing access tools. So the book will be posted in a ASL interpretation on a YouTube video. There's going to be audio description. We have an ebook version, and we also have image descriptions available for all the images in the book.
That's exceptional. Wow. And so that website is wemovetogether.ca. And so people can go check out a whole bunch of more information about the book. The way that I like to close this podcast every single time is how I'll do it again today. Can you share maybe a little bit of how you think disability can save the world?
Well, I mean, I'll go first. What I was thinking when you had posed that question, and I know you posed it at the end of the podcast, is that disability justice. I think disability justice politics, in a sense, and also the narrative that is put forward in our book, is that disability might not be able to change the world on its own, right? We move together. That it's not the singular answer to transformative change. But disability does have something, I think, profound to teach us about how we might enact change, the process through which we might enact change. So one of the things I've kind of learned a lot about by kind of being a body and a mind in the world, a varying body and mind in the world. And one of the things that I think I've learned a lot through like various disability relationships is that change never happens alone. It's always, happening in relation to other beings, other entities, other relationships, this idea of interdependence. And I think disability offers us kind of a way of thinking about our interdependencies, a way of considering and then reconsidering, are we maintaining good relations with our various counterparts in this world? And so I think disability offers us a space to think about how we move together. And then moving together is what changes the world, or what offers us a way of enacting transformative social change.
I fully endorse that position.
I guess my non-academic response would be, I think that something that is very noticeable during this pandemic times is, how the way that we all have had to kind of adapt to life in the pandemic, with living with COVID and with all these restrictions, and that's something that disabled people have done really well all along, like, because there's something that they know of, like the having to adapt, having to live with in a world that offers restrictions and limitations, and that's something that we can all learn from, how to how to negotiate all these limitations, how to pause, how to move slower, how to think about all the things about access. When we talk about like Zoom meetings, or how to make them accessible to everyone, how we make sure that is not having your background on Zoom or your camera on is equitable, and all of these things that the disability community have been living through, and I think that's applicable to us all, and we can learn from.
I think another way that disability saves the world is that there is no one solution to all of the problems that we face. And so anyone who's familiar with disability community will know that you can have endless checklists of best accessibility practices. You can have, universal design and all of these things, and there's still going to be people that are left out, or non-human components of the world that are treated poorly. And so it's really important to come to the table knowing that there's not going to be one solution to solve our problems, and that we're going to need to collaborate with many different people, things, animals, species.
Thank you all for your very thoughtful responses to the question. Thank you for writing this wonderful book. It's a pleasure to read and reread. And thank you for coming on the podcast. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Fady.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Thanks again to Kelly, Anne, and Eduardo for coming on the show. Please get in touch by sending us an email at disabilitysavestheworld@gmail.com. If you're interested to learn more about me, check out my website, fadyshinuda.com. This podcast is hosted and produced by me, Fady Shinuda, and is edited by Yasmina Martinez. Thank you for listening, and see you next time on Disability Saves the World.